بچه سلام، خیلی خوش اومدین به جلسه بعدیمون در کورس ادبیات آمریکا. من دارم این ویدیو رو روز شنبه ریکورد میکنم براتون، چون حقیقتا به این نتیجه رسیدم انقدر حجم مطالب مربوط به دوره 1820 تا 1865 بالاست که اگر بخوام جلسه آنلاین برگزار کنم احتمالاً یه 3 ساعت طول بکشه، چون خب قاعدتا به صورت منسجم نمیشه صحبت کرد، خسته میشین، باید وسطش یه بریکی میدادم بهتون. بعد از اون برم دقیقا من بعد کلاس شما یه کلاس دیگه دارم که خب سریع باید دقیقا رأس ساعت مثلا 2:45 کلاس رو تموم میکردم و عملا نمیرسیدیم در واقع. و همین دلیل تصمیم گرفتم که جلسه امروزمون رو آفلاین ریکورد کنم، چون خب خودم وقتی ریکورد میکنم قاعدتا وسطش میتونم ریکوردینگ رو پاس کنم یا استراحتی بکنم و بعد ادامه بدم و اون ویدیوی منسجم به اصطلاح یک پارچه رو بعدا براتون آپلود کنم. پس دلیلش در واقع این بود که خیلی برای شما هم خسته کننده نباشه که مثلا 2 ساعت تموم بشینین و به حرفای من گوش بدین. اینطوری خب خیلی راحت‌تر میتونین در طول چند ساعت یا در طول 1-2 روز ویدیو رو نگاه کنین. ولی خواهش میکنم ازتون که ویدیوی 1820 تا 1865 رو خیلی با دقت ببینین، چون یکی از مهمترین دوره های ادبیات آمریکاست. نه تنها در حوزه رشد یک تردیشن و سنت ادبی در آمریکا، بلکه حتی برای توسعه های شهری و تکنولوژیکی آمریکا. و خب اتفاقاتی که توی آمریکا میفته توی این دهه هایی که براتون مشخص کردم واقعا مهم هستند و بهتون توصیه میکنم که این دوره رو با دقت بسیار بسیار بیشتری بخونین. آثاری هم که تولید میشن آثار فوق‌العاده تری هستن. Okay, so without further ado, let's begin our journey into 1820s up until the 1865, the end of the American Civil War. This period, as I've written for you here, is a defining period because most of what you are going to learn in this period is actually going to be very essential to your general understanding of American culture and literature in general. This period, just to summarize it very quickly, witnessed some of the greatest minds of and some of the greatest talents in literature, writers including Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, Walt Whitman, Dickinson, Thoreau, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Edgar Allan Poe, Frederick Douglass, the African American writer. These are all wonderful writers who continued writing in these decades, started writing in these decades, and continued consistently and published some of the most central and fundamental works of American literature. And so these writers brought about a literary renaissance for America, and they helped American writing achieve its maturity. And now it is in this period that all critics unanimously agree that American maturity in terms of literature was achieved between 1820s and 1865. Now, unfortunately, the general belief until the early 20th century even was that, well, English literature, literature produced in England was way, way more superior than the literature produced in the United States. And that's why the writers I've actually highlighted now, they were obscured, they were unknown in their own lifetimes. Nobody read them, they had very little readership. But then in the mid-19th century, suddenly everybody started realizing their greatness, their magnificent talent. And we owe this to a writer called Matthiessen. So it was because of Mathiessen's book, American Renaissance, Art and Expression in the Age of Emerson and Whitman, that critics all around the world now suddenly realized, oh my God, what a perfect collection of writers. And so suddenly this idea that I told you here changed. And now they were saying, hey, wait a minute, maybe American literature in the 19th century was superior than literature produced in England because simply because they were so diverse. They produced works in different genres, they talked about so many different issues. And so, after Matthyson's book, critics and readers started focusing even more than before on American literature. And so this book was really, really important for us. Now, according to Matthyson's book, this Renaissance was inspired in the 1830s by the writings of Emerson and then came into its maturity in the 1850s with Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, Melville's Moby Dick, Thoreau's Walden, and of course Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, all of which are some of the most important books ever published in the United States. And that is a huge claim, but it is true nonetheless. So, so we owe the recognition that these writers are now enjoying to Matthison, because without Matthison, maybe these writers would continue to be unknown and obscure. Now, the idea of this American Renaissance that Matthison talked about was challenged, of course, years later because of some reasons, four reasons in particular. So everybody said that, yeah, okay, yeah, we know that this was an American Renaissance. We had so many wonderful writers. Hey, we are not trying to undermine them. هدفمون این نیست که به اصطلاح افتخارات و که این نویسنده ها کسب کردن یا مثلا آثاری که اینا نوشتن رو زیر سوال ببریم. نه، مشکل ما با اون لفظ کلمه رنسانسیه که آقای متایسن به کار برده. ببینیم مشکل منتقدین آقای متایسن چی بود. You know, those people who criticized Matthyson's American Renaissance book believed that, well, when Matthison was writing his book, about this period, he excluded significant contributions of women or minority readers like African Americans. Why is this important? Because when you read Matthyson's book, it seems like he claims that American Renaissance was only created by Emerson, Thoreau, Hawthorne, all of these people who are like, I'm sorry, white people. And so they say that, okay, yes, it was a Renaissance, but this Renaissance was also helped by women writers, by female writers, by minority writers. So if you want to really talk about Renaissance, you have to also include the contributions of those writers too, because they were also significant. The other problem that critics of Matthison had was that he had little interest in popular authors and he was only focusing on the big names. So he doesn't really talk about like poets of the period, Lydia Sigourney or Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. These were very, very popular writers among ordinary people, but they didn't have big names, right? Also, another criticism is that Matthison shows little interest in the works published outside Massachusetts and New York, as if, for example, works published in the Midwest or, for example, I don't know, let's say in California, are not important. And so he only focuses on people and writers whose works were published in Massachusetts and New York, which is a problem because there were other writers who published their works elsewhere. How about them? Another important criticism in relation to Matthyson's book is that he didn't really address some of the important contexts which are important to our understanding of American literature. آثار ادبی بدون اشاره به اینکه توی چه موقعیت تاریخی و مکانی و زمانی منتشر شدن عملا یه جای کار میلنگه اگه این کارو نکنید. So Tyson does not talk about slavery, does not talk about immigration or other social or political concepts and contexts which influence the literature of this period. And so a lot of people have an issue with that. And so the final criticism that these people have when it comes to Matthyson's book is that, well, they also emphasize that, you know, uh, people like Matthysson and his followers focused and emphasized on the separateness of English and American literature as if they were two completely separate things and they didn't influence each other. But no, you know, they were writing in the same language. They were reading each other's works. They influenced each other. یعنی مثلا متایسن اینطوری کتابش رو نوشته که این نویسنده های جینیسی هستن که اصلا آثار نویسنده های انگلیس رو نخوندن، خودشون صفر درصد تولید یک ادبیات ملی رو مثلا انجام دادن، در حالی که اصلا اینطوری نبوده. نویسنده های این دوره به شدت تحت تاثیر نویسنده های انگلیس و حتی اروپا و حتی نویسنده های کلاسیک یونان باستان و اینها بودن، ولی متایسن به این تأثیر هیچ اشاره‌ای نمیکنه. And finally, the criticism that these people have is that, well, the idea of a renaissance is usually applied to a concept that, or to a situation in which somebody was alive and then they died and then they were born again. But American literature was just in the process of being born. میگم بابا ادبیات آمریکا اصلا تازه داشت زاده میشد. یعنی چی رنسانس؟ اصلا لفظ رنسانس به چه معنیه؟ لفظ رنسانس برای وقتیه که یه چیزی مثلا صدها سال بوده بعد مرده یا از محبوبیت افتاده، حالا دوباره مردم بهش روی خوش نشون دادن و یک ریبرث رو تجربه کرده. And so they say that, well, this is meaningless because American literature is just being born right now. It's in the process of being born. میگم بابا تازه داره به دنیا میاد اصلا. یعنی چی مثلا rebirth یا renaissance? So that's why a lot of people disagree with, you know, the term and they don't like it, American, or they don't like American Renaissance. All of the criticisms I told you in the previous slide, all of it, you know, does not really intend to undermine the influence of these writers. They are not saying that, no, these writers are not great. Absolutely not. The literature of this period was truly influential in the development of an American identity, an American literary tradition. All they are saying is that this literature should be studied in much broader contexts. We have to look at everything. We have to include more writers. We have to talk about political and social contexts of the period. Okay? So it's really important. For example, one of the things that Matthysson fails to talk about is that he starts with 1830s and says that, hey, 1820s was not really important. But when we look at it, 1820s was really, really important. And that's what we are going to talk about now. So again, one of the things that Matthysson was guilty of really was that he had a very narrow perspective. He didn't look at all the contexts, all the important issues. And one of those problems is that when he started talking about 1820 until 1865, he just quickly forgot about 1820s. And he said, okay, well, this period is not really important. Let's jump to 1830s when Emerson started publishing, because that's important. But when we look at 1820s, we realize that 1820s was also really, really important for us. But even the decades before that, right? So that now we are going to talk about this problem, the idea that 1820s was neglected. So we are going to see what happened in the 1820s that is important, but Matthysson completely ignored. Now, from 1770s onwards, like from the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War period, many of the critics and commentators in the United States were saying, hey, we're saying to the writers of America, you have to produce American texts. You have to produce American literature. از 1770 به بعد هر کسی که دستی براتش داشت نویسنده های آمریکایی رو گیر میداد بهشون باید اثر ادبی آمریکایی بنویسی ها. باید آمریکایی بنویسی، باید آمریکایی بنویسی. این به اصطلاح میشه گفت که این طعنه و تشرهای مداوم که هی تو داری تقلید میکنی از انگلیسی ها، ما نمیخوایم مقلد باشیم، ما میخوایم که اصل اوریجینال و اصلا اصیل آمریکایی داشته باشیم. 1820 بالاخره گوش نویسنده ها یکم جنبید و گفتن باشه این کارو میکنیم. So it was during the 1820s and not the 1850s that Matthiessen talks about that United States produced writers worthy of a great nation. So it was in this period, 1820s, that we have some of the best writers who produced a truly American kind of literature. That's why we say that Matthiessen was wrong in forgetting about the 1820s. And so just look at the names of these people: Washington Irving, William Cullen Bryant, James Fenimore Cooper, and Catherine Sedgwick. All of these writers were so important and their works were so influential that you cannot simply ignore them. And it is also fascinating that the 1850s that Matthiessen and others talk about, the writers of the 1850s were so obscure in their own lifetime that it is really surprising when we say, okay, what was Matthiessen talking about when he said that these writers were, American writers because Americans liked them? No, people, big names that all of us know, like for example Melville, Thoreau, Whitman, and even Hawthorne, had really small readership. اصلا مخاطبین گسترده‌ای نداشتن بگی کتاباشون فقط چون اسم ملویل روش پرفروش میشد. اصلا. و حتی شاعرایی مثل امیلی دیکنسون که اصلا کلا ناشناخته بودن توی عصر خودشون. پس اون چیزی که متایسن میگه که دهه 1850 یک امریکن لیتریچر رو وجود آورد که آمریکایی‌ها بهش به اصطلاح میشه گفت با آغوش باز اونا رو پذیرفتن، اصلا اینطوری نبود. اصلا خود نویسنده های اون دوره هم میدونستن که خوانندگان آمریکایی به اونها اقبالی نشون ندادن. So that's the problem. But for 1820s it was completely different. All people enjoyed reading Washington Irving, enjoyed reading Bryant, enjoyed reading Fenimore Cooper. And that's why we say that it was during the 1820s that like this kind of national literature came into existence. And that's the next topic that we are going to talk about: American literary nationalism in the 1820s. Now, we know that the American Revolution was successful, and now a lot of people were feeling patriotic. They loved the new republic. They loved their new country. And so those who were writers showed their patriotic feelings through their literary works. And so we call this literary nationalism. These patriotic writers started producing American works very, very quickly. Even though some of them were not really good, but they started showing their patriotic feelings as soon as the American Revolution was successful. We have some of the earliest examples of patriotic literature, like Timothy Dwight's The Conquest of Canaan, or for example, Joel Barlow's The Columbiad. These are some of the earliest examples in which writers show their literary nationalism. یعنی اون حس ملیگرایی رو تو این آثار میشه دید. ولی خب یه ترسی هم وجود داشت توی اون دوره. احتمالاً اگر با خب شما سیری در تاریخ ادبیات انگلیس رو خوندین میدونین که کلاً اواخر قرن 18 که دیگه کم کم به قرن 19 برسیم، دنیا واقعا در حال تغییر بود. هر جایی سرک میکشیدی یه انقلابی در حال رخ دادن بود. خود همین اتفاقا یکی از تاثیرگذارترین عوامل بر مکتب ادبی رمانتیسیزمه. یعنی اون حس تغییر، این حسی که یه دنیای جدیدی داره به وجود میاد، در واقع همه جا بود. در نتیجه خب ما انقلاب آمریکا رو داشتیم، بعد انقلاب فرانسه رو داشتیم. آمریکا یا این همزمان شدن تقریبیشون با انقلاب فرانسه باعث شد اونا تجربه فرانسوی ها رو نگاه کنن که بعد انقلاب چه بلایی سر مردم اومد. اون دوره رو بهش میگن Reign of Terror. توی دوره بعد از انقلاب به فرانسه کلی از کسایی که حتی کوچکترین نقشی در مثلا سیستم قبلی داشتن، نمیدونم 30,000 نفر یا 300,000 نفر دستگیر میشن، تبعید میشن، کشته میشن. خود همین باعث شد که درون آمریکایی‌ها یه ترسی به وجود بیاد که شاید این نشنالیتی که بهش میبالن، این دموکراسی که قراره بر اساس اون اصلا هویتشون رو بسازن، خیلی چیز شکننده ایه. نکنه مثلا فرانسه بشن که این به اصطلاح انتقام و انتقام گیری و کشت و کشتار مردم هنوزم ادامه داشته باشه. And so they were really, really frightened. And this kind of fear was exacerbated, became worse in the War of the 1812 with England. Now, in 1812, England had another go to reclaim America as a land of the Commonwealth, as a land belonging to the monarchy in England. And so there was another war, the War of 1812, which, kind of made things worse for Americans. This kind of fear was really, really, frightening for the Americans, because English troops kind of attacked DC in 1814 and then burned the Capitol. اون ساختمان کنگره و فلان و اینایی که ساخته بودن رو کلن آتیش زدن, and the White House as well, which again showed the fragility, که بازم میگم اون شکننده بودن این آمریکای جدید رو نشون میداد. But of course all of this changed when one of the generals of the American army, a very significant person who later became a president in the United States, Andrew Jackson, finally outnumbered the English troops, and then in New Orleans, and then they kind of won the war with England in 1815. Why am I talking about this? Well, one reason is that I just wanted to show you the fact that there was fear too. Yeah, there was confidence, there was nationalism, there was patriotic feelings, but there was fear too that maybe our revolution is not going to be a successful one. And this war showed the fragility of the American nation, but of course they kind of won the war. Also important is the fact that from this New Orleans War in 1815 and Andrew Jackson's victory came out a national mythology for a national hero, for a Republican hero who is anti-aristocratic. Or of course he is, because she did not have a place in literature back then. Anti-monarchical. He was against the monarchy of England. He was a person from a very, very poor background, an obscure background, who incarnated all of the strengths and the virtues of the US nation. یعنی یک اسطوره به اصطلاح ملی، از یک قهرمان ملی به وجود اومد. شخصی که مثلا از یک بک‌گراند خیلی ضعیفی اومده ولی ضد طبقه اشرافی، ضد مثلا مونارکی انگلیس و تونسته اونا رو شکست بده. به وجود اومدن این اسطوره ملی باعث شد که ادبیات این دوره یهو رونق بگیره. نوشتن آثاری از دلیری های همچین مثلا قهرمانی و از قدرت مثلا و اون حس ملیگرایی که این شخصیت توشون به وجود آورد. And so, well, Andrew Jackson, this myth was based on the character of Andrew Jackson, and uh, he was later elected president in the United States in 1828. But of course, the character of Andrew Jackson was not without its problems. Andrew Jackson also had some problems because he, after winning the war of 1812 with England, he actually fought Indians in the southeastern region of the United States, the part which is now the state of Florida. And even later on, he became president, but he was still a slave owner. So he was a slave owner. But so we are not saying that Andrew Jackson was a person without any problems. He did have his own problems, but his victory in New Orleans created the national myth and included and triggered a lot of writers to talk about their nationalism in literature, of course. And so after this war, again, all of the journals, all of the literary journals in America, again, called the writers, hey, you have to write about this American hero. You have to produce an American literature. And so we do have, for example, one important journal here, the North American Review, which was, like the most popular kind of journal back then, and a lot of critics who were writing in this journal started calling for an American literature. For example, one of the critics of the period, Walter Channing, urged his countrymen in this journal to write, to produce a literature of our own. هرچند خودش هم اعتراف میکرد که تقریبا چیره شدن بر اون قدرت ادبیات انگلیس کار سختی میتونه باشه. We have another critic as well, Edward Tyrrell Channing, who in 1816 talked about this issue of national literature, and he says that a national literature will have but feeble claims to excellence and distinction. یعنی اولش خیلی نمیتونیم ادعای خوب بودن و متمایز بودن داشته باشیم. When it stoops to put on foreign ornament and manner, and to adopt from other nations images, allusions, and of course a metaphorical language which are perfectly unmeaning and sickly out of their birthplace. وقتی که یعنی این پیش شرطه چیه؟ وقتی میگه یک ادبیات ملی خیلی نمیتونه ادعاهای قوی داشته باشه که من اکسلنتم یا من متمایزم تا زمانی که کرنش بکنه، یعنی دلا بشه، خم بشه و از کشورهای بیگانه بخواد مثلا فرم رو بگیره یا محتوا رو بگیره، از کشورهای دیگه بخواد تقلید کنه، نمیدونم ایماژهاش رو از اونا بگیره، تلمیح‌های ادبیش به اونا باشه، حتی زبان متافوریکش رو از نویسنده‌های انگلیسی بگیره. پس داشت میگفت که اگه میخوای آمریکایی بنویسی نباید نگاهت به مثلا ادبیات انگلیسی یا مثلا کشورهای دیگه باشه، خودت سعی کن به صورت خلاقانه یه چیزی رو تولید کنی و از تقلید بپرهیزی. And so again after a couple of years in 1818 Suleiman Brown publishes a book called An Essay on American Poetry, and he actually asserts that hey, look, technically speaking, you have not won the War of 1812 yet. And so this claim was kind of weird because people knew that, yeah, Andrew Jackson won the War of 1812 in New Orleans in 1815. But Suleiman was talking about something else. He said that you haven't won the War of 1812 until you manifest your victory in literature. تا وقتی که این موفقیت رو در حوزه ادبیات و تولیدات ادبی به تصویر نکشی، عملا این که بگی من جنگ رو بردم بی منطقه. بله، نیروهای انگلیسی رو فراری دادی، ولی هنوزم تاثیر انگلیسی ها رو تو موجوده، هنوزم داری آثار انگلیسی نه آثار آمریکایی تولید میکنی. And so he was saying that you have to produce American literature so that your victory is completed. And that's the quote right here from an essay on American poetry. He says, the proudest freedom to which a nation can aspire, not expecting even political independence, is found in complete emancipation from literary thraldom. میگه اون پر افتخارترین آزادی که میتونه یک نیشن به دست بیاره، یک ملت به دست بیاره و به خاطرش تلاش کنه، میگه حتی من منظورم چیزی فراتر از استقلال سیاسیه. یعنی این آزادی که من میخوام بگم اهمیتش از استقلال و آزادی سیاسی هم بیشتره. اینه که شما تو خودت رو و اون لیتراری تردیشنت رو مستقل کنی از هر گونه تأثیر سایر ملل. And that's what Suleiman Brown is saying. And so all of the writers were trying so hard to produce an American literature. But of course, the critics in the period continued belittling them. میگم منتقدای دوره فقط مسخرهش میکردم که این چیه نوشتی. So for example, Sidney Smith, one of those critics who was living in this period in the 1820s, actually made fun of the effort of the American writers to produce a true American work. And so he asked a funny question, like, in the four quarters of the globe, who reads an American book? Like, are they stupid? I'm sure nobody is going to read an American book. But of course, he was wrong. Now, Sidney Smith and most of the other critics were completely wrong, because most of the books published by American writers became really popular, not just in America, but also in other countries all around the world. And so, like, for example, Charles Brockden Brown's novels of the 1790s became so popular in England. And so, Smith's attack was, the attack right here was just ludicrous, because we also have other significant writers that I told you about, Irving, Bryant, Cooper, etc., whose works really, really became popular. So Irving's The Sketchbook, a collection of short stories. We are going to read one of his short stories, Rip Van Winkle, later on. But Bryant's poems, Cooper's The Spy and the Pioneers, actually showed to people, not just in the United States, but also in England and all other European countries, that, hey, American culture is, taking shape, is actually finding its place among the literatures of great countries. So these critics were actually wrong. It is also something important that I don't want to forget is that, well, during the 1820s, people also liked the kind of literature which was influenced by English writers. So it's not like all of the people were saying that, hey, no, forget about the influence of England. No, that's not true. There were even writers and also ordinary people who were saying that it's okay to be in conversation with the English literary traditions. You don't have to be 100% distinct. No. So this is one important point I wanted to make, that not all Americans, hated the English literary tradition. Some of them actually encouraged the writers to just, work with the English writers, to influence each other, Another important issue that I want to talk about is that, I talked about patriotic and nationalistic literature, but this doesn't mean that all of the writers of this period were producing nationalistic or patriotic literature. No. Some of the most important writers of the period actually considered patriotic literature to be nonsense. یعنی میگفتن ببین ادبیات پتریاتیک و ملیگرا
چرت و پرت. یعنی چی من فقط با یک هدف سیاسی نشون دادن آمریکا به عنوان یک قدرت برتر بخوام ادبیات بنویسم؟ پس اون خلاقیت من چی میشه؟ اصلا من شاید راجع به یه سری موضوعات ساده میخوام بنویسم. And so some of the most influential writers of the period just completely discarded the idea that all literature should be patriotic. All of the influential writers I've been talking about, Irving, Bryant, and Cooper, just wrote books which were not patriotic at all. So I just wanted to make that clear too, that not all literature was patriotic. Okay, now again, when I say that these people wrote books that were not patriotic, again, I'm not saying that like 100%. I'm not saying that they didn't like, their country. No, they liked their country, but they were focusing on other issues as well. For example, one thing which is very, very obvious in the works is that they believe in the importance of describing the natural landscape of America. میخواستن طبیعتش رو توصیف کنن و مثلا طبیعت و مناظر دیدنی که توی آمریکا وجود داشت. Just describing this kind of unspoiled land, and they wanted to turn it into like a metaphor for the possibility of growth. یعنی مثلا میگم اینطوری نبود که دیگه کلا به کشور خودشون هیچ علاقه‌ای نداشته باشن، نه اصلا. اتفاقا میگفتن که میشه راجع به کشور خودمون هم صحبت کنیم، ولی راجع به یه سری چیزای دیگهش، مثلا من میرم زیبایی‌های بصری طبیعت کشورم رو و این unspoiled land، این سرزمین بیکرانی که میشه هر جاش اراده کنی بشینی و میتونه بهت کمک کنه که زندگی تو ادامه بدی، من میخوام این رو به تصویر بکشم و مثلا تبدیلش کنم به یک استعاره ای از اینکه ما میتونیم رشد داشته باشیم در این کشورمون. And so, as I said, these writers try to explore different aspects of course, this kind of nationalism. And so, the works produced by Irving, Bryant, and Cooper raised some difficult questions too, especially questions about the future of America, questions about its strengths and also its weaknesses and vulnerabilities, questions about the character of America. Who are we as an American? What kinds of qualities or characteristic features do we have? And of course, what are some of the potentials of our republic, of our country, that need to be explored? So these were the questions that the writers highlighted here for you were addressing. Now, the next topic that we are going to talk about, of course, after a short break, I need to just drink some water. But of course, you will see the video without interruption. I'm just going to pause the recording and then, resume it in just a few minutes. Is that, well, the literary marketplace, how was the literary marketplace in this expanding nation? Now we know that America became independent and now it was expanding its scope, right? It was expanding not only geographically, like the War of Mexico, for example, when they tried to, expand their land, but also like there were more and more cities and there were more and more people who could write. And so there was this kind of marketplace which was expanding. And so people had, like writers had new readers. So we're going to talk about this kind of expansion in both in the geography of the country and in the literary marketplace after just, just a few seconds. Okay, so as I said, the country was, expanding, and so there was also a large group of people in the United States who were demanding more and more books. And well, because the number of the books was produced by Americans, I'm sorry. Okay, apologies again. My cell phone just rang. Anyway, so as I was saying,
the American people needed more books, and because probably there weren't enough books back then, one of the things that happened was that the public demanded books be imported from other countries. And that's why when America started becoming a more industrialized country and we had an infrastructure for the distribution of goods, like, for example, ships coming to the port, railroads extending their reach in the United States. Well, people were saying, okay, why don't you import books and then distribute it like nationally so that we can also read books by other people in other countries as well? And this is one of the things that happened in the United States because uh, now people demanded more books, and then, well, the authorities started importing more books. And that's why we have, for example, a lot of continental writers becoming so popular in the United States. Robert Burns becomes increasingly popular. All of the English romantics, including Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, Keats, and others, became so popular. And so the Brownings became very popular. Sir Walter Scott's historical novels became very popular in the United States, as well as the works of Charles Dickens. And so, as I said, this kind of like industrialization that occurred in the United States helped establish, the taste of Americans because now they had access to more international writers. Now, when we come back to the United States and talk about the publishing culture in the United States, the story is a little bit different because, like in 1800s, especially in the beginning decades, we don't have a lot of publishing houses or publishing firms. And so, writers had to find a way to publish their book like elsewhere. Sometimes they had to like work with a local printer, and it will demanded a lot of money. And so a national marketplace for American literature was very slow to develop because, well, even when a printer or a publishing house, you know, became increasingly interested in the publication of works, one of the questions that they really thought about was that, okay, who am I going to publish? A person like Sir Walter Scott or Charles Dickens, whom everybody knows and can probably sell well here, or, for example, an obscure writer whom nobody knows, like Emily Dickinson. Am I going to waste my paper, my ink, for a poet whom nobody knows and is not going to sell? No, absolutely not. I'm going to use my resources to publish internationally recognized writers. And so, as I said, well, a national market for truly American literature was really slow to develop. Another problem that didn't really help American writers was the copyright law. And so, at first, well, they were afraid that their books would be just copied or pirated without their permission, and so they wouldn't really make a lot of money. And so there was a law in the United States, in a national copyright law, which passed in 1790, but of course didn't really go into full effect until 1891, right? And so, because there was not this kind of international law, well, American writers were, even though they really wanted to publish their works, they were still afraid that, they're not going to make enough money. This law, or the lack of this law until 1891, when it was fully enforced, also frightened some international writers uh, because English writers were also becoming angry because most publishers in the United States just pirated those books, just copied them without permission. And so that's why they wrote so many letters to American publishers, and they wrote cease and desist letters, which is a kind of letter that says, stop doing this or I'm gonna prosecute you. I'm gonna sue you. I'm gonna write a complaint in a police department or something. And so uh, this kind of the lack of a copyright law made everything really, really difficult. And because, well, people could not really make a lot of money because using their writing as a profession. And as I've written here for you, most of the writers of the period could not really support themselves only by publishing works. So Brian supported himself as a newspaper editor because his books were not going to sell. Hawthorne received so many political positions and worked for the government. Emerson was fortunate enough to have a wealthy wife, and so he was living off his wife's money. And Melville was financially struggling all his life, and so he worked for the custom house in New York. And so Longfellow, another very, very popular writer in this period, started taking some classes at Harvard to make some money and influence the younger minds of writers in the United States. So as you can see, all of these writers had to have a second job, a job that would pay the bills, because writing was not really going to cut it. So some American writers came up with a solution, and they said that, okay, because we don't have a really strict copyright law here in the United States that can give me money and royalties for all of the copies which people are going to buy, well, I'm going to publish my books somewhere else. And that's why a lot of the writers of the period tried to publish their books in England. But of course, this proved to be really, really difficult. Some of the most popular authors who did really well and successfully sold lots of copies in the United States were, just funny enough, slavery writers. And the reason why they were popular because, well, England was still angry with Americans, right? Because, well, England used to have complete control of America, or at least partial control of America. And so the reason why English people were interested in anti-slavery books was because they wanted to see the bad sides of America now that they had broken up. مثل میگم جوانایی که مثلا بریک اپ میکنن و حالا حال میکنن که بدبختی مثلا پارتنر قبلیشون رو اکسشون رو ببینن. So this is why English people really, really enjoyed anti-slavery books, because it showed that, yeah, America believed in slavery. America is bad without us. And so they completely forgot that they had introduced the slavery themselves in the first place. And so anyway, they just wanted to, shame Americans into having this kind of feeling that, hey, without us, you are nothing. And so Frederick Douglass, the African American writer I told you about a few minutes ago, and William Wells Brown, they found incredible success in the Great Britain. And so, as you can see here, the first African American novel, Will Brown's Clotho, was actually published in England. So this book is important because it was the first, not the first American novel, but the first African American novel. It was published in England. And of course, as I said, Harriet Beecher Stowe was also very popular in England. And most of the writers who did well in England, as I said, were writers who were criticizing America, not patriotic writers, of course, because, well, English people did not want to publish patriotic American literature, of course. Now, as I said, well, this period, 1820 to 1865, was a turning point for America because more and more people wanted literature. The nation's population was growing. There were a lot of technological developments going on, which allowed publishers to bring more works in and then publish them or distribute them successfully. We had urbanization and industrialization, which, when you have urbanization, there are more people living in the cities. they are probably a little bit richer, and so they have more free time. They don't have to work all the time, so they need some pastime hobbies like reading books. And so this on the one hand, and the expansion of the railroads, canals, and other forms of transportation on the other hand, created a great economic opportunity for publishing books in the United States. And so in the 1820s onward, uh, you know, U.S. Believed in the fact that Americans believed in the fact that we can become the greatest nation all around the world. But to do this, we have to expand everything. Now, if you even today, this idea exists in the United States. Everything has to be big. Everything has to be in its extended form, right? And so like if you buy clothes in the United States, an X large shirt in the United States is like 3X large in the European format or in the Asian format. And so everything has to be like super big in the United States. Even if you look at the advertisements, you can see that all they advertise is a Big Mac, or I don't know, like huge McNuggets, etc., etc. And so this idea that okay, we are a nation, we need to expand our railroads, we need to expand our territories, existed in the United States. And that's why some of the uh, we can say expansion uh, projects in the United States also happened in this period. And so for example, we have people who, forces who want to gain more and more geographical territories by like fighting in Mexico and trying to attach Mexico as another state to United States mainland. And also there are the federal government trying to expand the railroad so that we can have access in all so that they can have access in all four corners of the United States. مثالی که براتون زدم راجع به ایالت فلوریدا بود که خب اونجا محل سکونت ایندین ها بود که باز با ریل کشی و بعد حمله به اونها قشنگ مثلا اونجا رو هم گرفتن و تبدیلش کردن به یک ایالت دیگه از دولت مثلا فدرال. و همین گسترده تر کردن اون پهنای جغرافیایی آمریکا چه در داخل با ریل کشی به نقاط دور افتاده و بیرون کردن ایندین ها و نیتیف ها به تبدیل کردنش به یک ایالت شهری و شهرسازی های بیش از حد، چه خارج از آمریکا تلاش برای مثلا میگن دیگه مثلا گرفتن و تصرف کردن خاک مکزیک، اینا همه باعث شد که در حرکت بودن، گسترده تر کردن به اصلی ترین مضامین فرهنگ آمریکایی توی این دوره تبدیل بشه. And so one of the things that people also saw was the establishment of roads, modern roads, canals, and railroads. How was this portrayed in literature? Well, easy. We have travel literature in this period. So one of the manifestations of this kind of expansion in literature is the huge number of travel books which were published, because people were just taking the trains to all these unknown places in the country. There are some good examples of this, of people traveling to the Midwest, like for example Carolyn Kirkland's A New Home, Who Will Follow, or for example Margaret Fuller's Summer and the Lakes. They became increasingly popular in this, of course, period. We also have, for example, other travels to the Pacific Northwest. So we have Richard Henry Donna's 2 Years Before the Mast, or Francis Parkman's The Oregon Trail. And also traveling to California in what became known as the California Gold Rush, because more and more people were going to California because they had apparently found some gold mines there. So people were daydreaming about becoming rich overnight. We also have travel books talking about the gold rush in the 1850s in California.
Because, as I said, there was urbanization and there was industrialization. Another form of writing also became popular in this period, and that's called urban writing, which talks about living in the city. It portrays city life, the creation of skyscrapers, modern buildings, or generally speaking, city life, and of course, the immigration of other people to the cities. In this period, we also have the proliferation of the publication of magazines and newspapers, which really helped, you know, the literary landscape in the United States, but also all around the world. We also have the same thing happening in England because in the 19th century in England, we have the publication of so many journals, newspapers, and we also have all of those periodicals that, for example, people like Addison and Steele were writing in. This kind of democratized literature because, well, magazines and newspapers were cheaper, and so people could buy them. And a lot of the writers of the period all around the world started publishing their books in magazines and newspapers before publishing them as a book. So, for example, in Russian literature, Dostoevsky started publishing all of the different chapters of Crime and Punishment in magazines before publishing it as a book. And in England, most of the 19th century writers, including, for example, Charles Dickens, started publishing their stories, or even, for example, George Eliot, started publishing their books in magazines and newspapers, and then later on turned them into a book. And all of this, again, created a sensation for literature. It also created a profitable market for those who were trying to be professional writers. And so many of the writers of the period suddenly realized that, okay, well, maybe I can support myself financially through the publication of my books. And so writers like Sigourney, Poe, Fuller, Hawthorne, and Fern really worked on their craft, and they developed a good reputation for themselves as professional writers. Now, I told you that magazines and newspapers were really popular in this period. This is the name of two very uh, famous magazines in the period who both were published in Philadelphia, and they were really popular. Graham's and, of course, Godey's Lady's Book. So these two were the names of these two were very popular magazines published in the period. Now, the next issue that we are going to talk about here is that, again, as usual, women were neglected by the majority of the readers even. یعنی بحث فقط این نبود که نویسنده های مرد نویسنده های زن رو به حاشیه می بردن و اجازه پابلیش کردن بهشون نمیدادن، یا اینکه مثلا پابلیشرها اگه یه زن رو میدیدن مثلا میخندیدن. این همه جای دنیا وجود داشت. همین باعث میشه که مثلا نویسنده ها سعی کنند که یک الیاس یا مثلا یک اسم مستعار برای خودشون در واقع پیدا کنند که اصلا معلوم نشه اینا در واقع زن هستن. یعنی همین باعث میشه که مثلا یه خانمی مثل مریان ایونز با وجود اینکه کلی آثار فوق‌العاده نوشته، نویسنده فوق‌العاده‌ای، مجبور بشه که اسم جورج الیت رو برای خودش انتخاب کنه، چون اگر اسم زن بود اولا همین که پابلیشر قبول کرده منتشر کنه خود همین یه موفقیت بزرگه، چون اصلا خیلی از پابلیشرها اصلا موافقت نمی‌کردن با اینکه اثر یک زن پابلیش بشه. نهایتا هم پیشنهادشون این بود که باشه حالا اثرت خوبه ولی یک الیاس، یک پن نیم برای خودت انتخاب کن، ترجیحاً اسم مردانه که من بتونم منتشر کنم و مردمم بخرن. یعنی این فقط مشکل این نبود، مشکل خواننده ها هم بود که مثلا نویسنده زن رو اصلا نمیخریدن که بخونن. And so as I said, a person like Marianne Evans chooses the name of George Eliot for herself, unfortunately. So women were again neglected, not only by the writers, by male writers, by the publishers, but also, unfortunately, by the readers in this period. And so they had to find some ingenious ways to enter themselves into the literary marketplace. And of course, they almost always succeeded. So they found their unique ways to enter the literary marketplace. Some of them self published, or some of them, as I said, chose male pen names for themselves because they really, really wanted to publish their works. And so the writings of these women have also survived. And so we have to look at them if we want to avoid the criticisms that people had for Matthiessen. If you remember, we said that Matthiessen was an important critic who gave us the idea of the American Renaissance, but he failed to take into consideration the contributions of women and minorities. So, this antebellum period, we are going to talk about step by step. We are going to talk about the English Civil War because that was also really, really important. It started in 1861 and it ended in 1865. The period before the American Civil War is called the antebellum period, and the period after the Civil War, after 1865, is called the postbellum period, which is post-war period. It is also known as the Reconstruction، دوره بازسازی. چون خب جنگ 4 سال طول کشید، کلی تلفات داشت، کلی جاها ویران شدن. حالا راجبش صحبت میکنیم، راجب Civil War، ولی صرفا میخواستم این کلمه رو براتون توضیح بدم که منظورم چیه در مورد ازش. So, much of the writing produced by women in the antebellum period focuses on domesticity, the idea of the domestic life, and it criticizes the idea of separate cultural spheres for men and women. So people like Margaret Fuller, they say that it's just nonsense to believe that, okay, the outer world is for men and the inner world of the house is for women. And so she criticizes the idea of the angel in the house. I'm sure you've heard of it. The angel of the house was a cliche that women, because they were soft, they were angelic, they belonged to the house, and the harsh world was not a good place for them. So Margaret Fuller criticizes this. She actually has a very important terminology for them called exaltadas. Exaltadas. Exaltadas are women who have successfully reconciled this outer world with the inner world, who have successfully connected the outer world as well as the world inside the house, and they can navigate, they can successfully work in both places. So, this exaltadas is actually a very good example of women who don't believe in the fact that there should be separate places for men and women, men working outside, women working inside. Uh, so, this is what I wanted to tell you, that even women successfully found their way into the marketplace. The next issue that we are going to talk about in relation to the period between 1820 and 1865 is, of course, the the huge number of conflicts which existed in America between the industrial North and the slave owners of the South, the agriculture of the South and the industries of the North. There was also a lot of reform going on everywhere. Reforming the conditions of black people, reforming the conditions of women, reform in the voting systems and privileges, etc. So we have to talk about these because understanding the culture of the United States in this period is as important as understanding the literature produced in this period. Now, most of the writers of this period believed in reform. They believed that yes, American Revolution was successful, but it needs improvement. We need to improve it. And so there were a lot of movements about slavery. So there were anti slavery protests. There was a protest revolving temperance. اعتقاد داشتن که نوشیدن الکل باعث میشه که از اون به رسیدن به اون آرمان هامون جلوگیری میکنه. در نتیجه موومنت های زیادی برای قدغن کردن الکل وجود داشت. There were women's rights movements and even anti-Catholic movements to, to create an independent church even for America. And so this theme of reform can be seen and can be found everywhere here. Everywhere. So if we go to the 1830s and 40s, most of the writers that are famous in this period talk about reform. پس 1820 رو تموم کردیم دیگه. گفتیم 1820 در همون حوزه نشنالیزم و اینها بیشتر کار میکرد با آثاری از واشنگتن ایروینگ، Bryant و of course Cooper. But when we go to the 30s and 40s, a new kind of literature is created, which is called the Transcendentalist movement in the history of American literature. Now, we will talk about this later on down the road, but I just wanted to start by telling you that this theme of reform is everywhere. So, Emerson, one of the most important writers of this period, talks about reform. He actually has an article called Man the Reformer. And so he says that in this paper, he says, the doctrine of reform had never such scope as the present hour. میگه این تم و این به اصطلاح ایده ریفورم هیچ وقتی به اندازه امروز نتونسته بود خودش رو مهم جلوه بده. And so Emerson begins talking about all of these reform movements which are happening in the United States, and he supports most of them. So in Emancipation in the West Indies, he talks about and he calls people to oppose slavery. And so he says that, look, we have to do something about this slave trade in our country. He also elsewhere talks about the value of temperance, the movement to banish alcoholic drinks. And also he talked at a women's rights convention تو یک کنوانسیون یا یک به اصطلاح سمیناری در مورد حقوق زنان هم شرکت میکنه. اونجا هم یک خطابه‌ای داره که میخونه. پس امرسن به عنوان یکی از اصلی ترین نویسنده های جنبش ادبی ترانسندنتالیزم اصلا کار خودش رو با صحبت کردن راجع به همین در واقع رفرم ها شروع میکنه و ادامه میده. و خب فقط میخواستم مثال بیارم براتون که این تم ریفورمی که راجع بهش صحبت کردیم تو همه نویسنده های معروف این دوره به خصوص آقای امرسن هم مشاهده میشه. And so Emerson believed that we have to do something about our country. And that's why he kind of created a literary movement in this period called the Transcendental Movement. But I have to explain it to you because this is really important for us, probably the most important part of today's lecture. Now, Emerson really liked the Romantics in Europe, like the English Romantics, the German idealists who influenced the Romantics, because they put so much emphasis on the individual mind of people. He was so influenced that he wrote an article called The American Scholar. In American Scholar and other writings, Emerson says that Americans have to break their dependency on the muses of Europe and to rely on themselves. میگه آمریکایی‌ها دیگه بسه. انقدر نگاهتون به سمت انگلیس نباشه که ببینیم اونا چی کار میکنن، تو اروپا چی کار میکنن که ما هم همون کارو بکنیم. You have to rely on yourself. And so the main argument of this transcendentalist movement, it has a lot of different aspects. We will talk about it later. But the main argument is the importance of individuality, the importance of individualism as opposed to conformity. یکی از اصلی ترین و بنیادی ترین مفاهیم ادبیات ترانسندنتال تکیه بر فردگرایی و حمله کردن به چیزی که بهش میگن کنفورمیتی یا همنوایی با جامعه. میگه انقدر نگاهت به دهن دیگران نباشه که اونا چی میگن تو هم همونو بگی. یکم برا خودت فکر کن، یکم برا خودت تلاش کن دنیا رو پیدا کنی و دنیا رو بفهمی. Don't just wait for me to tell you what to do. Try to find your own calling in life yourself. And so, this transcendental movement helped inspire so many writers who joined Emerson, Margaret Fuller, Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman, and many other writers, Poe Hawthorne, Melville Dickinson. They were kind of suspicious of Emerson's optimism that yes, Americans can become individual, but they really, really liked the idea and they were influenced by Emerson. And so Emerson continued this transcendentalist movement and he expanded it. And now he raised questions about everything. Like, for example, in his books, Self-Reliance and American Scholar, he raises questions about the value of history. آقا چرا اینقدر میگین تاریخ 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 مطالعه کن، به گذشته فکر کن، فلان کن، بهمان کن؟ چرا؟ نه واقعا چرا؟ چه اهمیتی داره نگاه کردن به گذشته؟ طرف باید خودش الان به درک مناسبی از دنیاش برسه. Then the next thing that he did was that he said that individuals have the ability to apprehend everything directly. They have the ability to understand everything directly. They have the ability to have a direct relationship with God. They have the ability to understand the world for themselves. And so he talked about this in his books, that how can we do this? How can we help individuals become independent learners and thinkers? He also raised some questions about the capacity of language to achieve and convey knowledge and how we can do this. گفت خب زبان هم یه ماهیت فراری داره. این چطور میشه زبان مثلا بهش اعتماد داشته باشیم که 100% مفهوم یک نفر رو بتونه منتقل کنه. And so he said that in order to understand the universe, to make sense of the universe, you have to focus on yourself, on your individual thoughts and insights rather than received authority. میگه ببین به جای اینکه معطل و منتظر یک اتھوریتی، یک شخص در قدرت باشی که بیاد بهت بگه چیکار کنی چیکار نکنی، اولا تو از کجا میدونی که اون خودش دنیا رو فهمیده یا نه؟ بعدش از کجا میدونی که از لنگویج استفاده سالمی کرده و قصد به اصطلاح اینکه سرتو کلاه بذاره نداره؟ چون از زبان میشه برای کلاهبرداری استفاده کرد. کسایی که زبان چربی دارن میتونن یه چی بهش میگن، یه پرنده رو به عنوان یه قناری بهت بفروشن، یه چیز اینطوری، یعنی سرت کلاه بذارن. پس میگه تو به جای اینکه منتظر حرف دیگران باشی، خودت با بینش خودت دنیا رو بشناس. That's what the Transcendentalist movement was all about. And so these Transcendentalists had the idea that a new era was beginning. And so we needed individual people. And so these were the critics of the contemporary society because they believed that there is a disease going on, unthinking conformity. همنوایی غیر انتقادی، یعنی اصلا طرف انتقاد نمیکنه، هر چی بهش میگن رو قبول میکنه. And they said that this is ridiculous. You have to find an original relation to the universe based on your individual insight. Okay? So this was the Transcendentalist movement in America, which I said was, which existed in New England in America, starting in like 1836 and continuing until the Civil War. These Transcendentalists actually created a club for themselves, which, as I said, included all of those famous writers. And they were getting together. They used to get together in this club, in this Transcendental Club, and they also published a periodical to express their opinions to the public, and the name of that periodical was The Dial. And they were against so many different things, but I just copied this from a glossary of literary terms by Abrams because it beautifully captures all of the things that the transcendental movement was writing against. They were opposed to rigid rationalism. میگفتن این به اصطلاح رشنالیزم یا توجه 100% به منطق خیلی هم نمیتونه جواب بده. تو باید به احساساتت هم توجه کنی. به empirical philosophy میگم، همون امپیریسیزم و به اصطلاح اینکه تمامی علم ما از طریق حواس پنجگانه میاد و ما از طریق مثلا فطرتمون یا از طریق مثلا شاید چه میدونم یک revelation به یک درکی برسیم، این هم زیر سوال میبردن. They were against social conformity, they were against materialism, and of course they were against commercialism. They said that life is not just about money. You have to find a direct kind of like individual relationship to the universe, and you can use your intuition. So you can read this later on. And of course, we will talk about Emerson in one of our future sessions. And we will talk about transcendentalism more when we get there. So I just wanted to create this kind of background for you so that you will be ready to understand Emerson's ideas when I give you homework for the future sessions, where you have to, of course, think about Emerson's ideas expressed in his works. But the ideas of reform was not just for women or for like the society in general. There were some kinds of movements for the working classes as well, especially immigrants who went to the United States in search of a better life, and so they had to work really, really hard. So there were reforms for working classes. There were reform for women's rights. یکی از اصلی ترین آثاری که چون توی کتاب خود نورتون هم اومده خیلی مهمه، اینه که همونطور که گفتم یه کنوانسیونی برگزار شد، یک سمیناری برگزار شد در سنکا فالز نیویورک که خب امرسن هم اونجا یک سخنرانی داشت، اما شاید مهمترین سخنرانی که اونجا انجام شد از خانمی بود به اسم الیزابت کادی استنتون. یه کتابی نوشت، یه مقاله‌ای نوشت به اصطلاح که اونجا خوند به اسم Declaration of Sentiments. کل اثرش رو اومد بر اساس اون Declaration of Independence بود، اون بیانیه اعلام استقلال آمریکا، دقیقاً به همون سبک نوشته. توی Declaration of Independence اون فاوندینگ فادرهای آمریکا اومدن از به اصطلاح اون ظلم و ستمی که انگلیس بهشون روا داشته بود صحبت میکردن. خانم استنتن میاد کلمه انگلیس رو بر میداره، اونو با مردهای جامعه جایگزین میکنه. یعنی با مرد و مرد سالاری هر جایی که گفتن مثلا تیرانی یا استبداد انگلیس، این میگه tyranny of men. و میگم اون میل رو به جای بریتیش تیرانی جایگزین میکنه که نشون بده که بله اونا انقلاب کردن، اما هنوز هم زنان از اون آزادی که گفتیم بهره مند نشدن. اینو جلسه قبل هم صحبت کردیم که اون فریدم انگار فریدم برای همه نبود، فریدم برای افراد مذکر سفید پوست بود فقط. And so this is a very famous book. This is actually from the Norton Anthology. And so she has written it in the same exact format of Declaration of Independence, but like she talks about how, for example, men try to suppress and oppress women. Let's take a look at this. I think it's good to read it. So, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among the people of the earth a position different from that which they have hitherto occupied, but one to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes that impel them to such a course. میگه اگه هر جایی توی اتفاقات دنیا یه نفر یا یه گروهی ادعا کنن که آقا من تا حالا جایگاه هم این بوده، ما تا حالا روی این پله وایسادیم، من میخوام یه 2 پله برم بالاتر از تو وایسم، میگه تو باید دلایلت رو توضیح بدی که چرا باید اونجا وایسی و من پایین تر از تو وایسم. We held these truths to be self-evident. ما این حقایق رو کاملا واضح و مبرهن میپنداریم. That all men and women are created equal and that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. یک سری حقوق مسلمی هم دارن. That among these are life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness. توی Declaration of Independence اینو نسبت به انگلیس میگه. میگه همه انسان ها یکسان زاده شدن و یعنی چی مثلا یک کشور دیگه بخواد آزادی ما رو سلب کنه؟ اینجا خانم استنتن میگه که مرد و زن یکسان آفریده شدن، چه دلیل و توجیهی داره که مردا بخوان آزادی خانوما رو سلب کنن؟ That to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of those who suffer from it to refuse allegiance. میگه اگه حق منو ضایع کنه اصلا من نیازی نیست پیروی کنم ازش. این ایده، اینکه اگه دولتی که قول داده من انتخابش کردم بخواد حقوق من رو تضییع کنه، من از قوانینش پیروی نمی کنم، تبدیل میشه به یکی دیگه از ایده هایی که ترانسندنتالیست ها بهش اعتقاد داشتن. Civil disobedience. اصلا یه اثری هم نوشتن دیگه با اسم Civil disobedience، آقای تارو نوشته. میشه نافرمانی مدنی. یه سری کارا رو انجام نمیدن که کار دولت مختل بشه. باز قراره توی هومورک هایی که انجام میدیم و اثرهایی که میخونیم از آقای تارو هم بخونیم. کتاب والدن آقای تارو دقیقا مثال اینه. اولا آقای تارو میره توی جنگل زندگی میکنه که مالیات و اینا نده. میگه چون من نمیخوام مالیات من برای جنگ شما کشتار مثلا مکزیکی ها استفاده بشه. و بعد از اون طرف راجع به بدیهای مثلا چیزای دیگه مثل صدای حرکت قطار و فلان و اینا هم به اصطلاح صحبت میکنه که باعث شده که اون روح آمریکایی در مقابل قدرت کاپیتالیسم و نمیدونم پول سرش رو فرود بیاره و ما دیگه اون روح اصیلمون رو از دست دادیم. حالا راجع به آقای تارو هم حتما با هم دیگه صحبت خواهیم کرد. Anyway, so as I said, well, there were reform movements everywhere, and so the women writers of the period, following the tradition by Stanton, questioned power, those in power, and wanted to find a place for themselves by asserting themselves into the society. And so it's interesting that even white women had a better had better opportunities than, let's say, for example, African American women. And so that's why the conditions of African American were the worst. And they try to show this in their works, of course. If we continue talking about reform, we have to talk about, as I said, some of the most important writers of the period who were criticizing this kind of nationalist discourse. Because if you remember, I told you that some of the most important writers of this period actually didn't like patriotic literature, didn't like nationalistic literature, because they believed that nationalistic literature tries to gloss over, tries to neglect the crimes which are happening in the country. And so some of the most important writers of the period, including Walt Whitman, they tried to talk about the ongoing national crimes which were happening back then, like the genocide of American Indians, the enslavement of black people, and of course the expansionism of America, which ignored national sovereignties, like for example Mexico. گفتم بابا اون یه کشور مستقل خودشه، یعنی چی من میخوام کشورمو گسترش بدم میرم به اونجا حمله میکنم. پس خیلی از نویسنده‌های این دوره در واقع همونطور که گفتم اون جنگ مکزیکی که تا چند بار بهش اشاره کردم، خیلی از نویسنده‌های اون دوره، حالا از حق نگذریم، که میگفتن خب بابا یه چیز طبیعیه دیگه، کشور ما میخواد قدرتمند باشه، در نتیجه ما میخوایم کشور گشایی کنیم دیگه. برای اونا نچرال بود. میگفتن بابا یه چیز طبیعیه دیگه، سرنوشت ما این بوده که کشور قوی و گسترده‌ای باشیم. اما نویسنده‌های اونایی که یکم سرشون به تنشون میارزید در واقع they were against it. So, for example, Thoreau spent a night in prison for protesting that, he hated to pay taxes to support the Mexican War. Or, for example, Melville called this kind of like the extinction of Native Americans, the genocide, the killing of, Americans, because they wanted a new state called Florida, called this the man's foulest crime. یعنی متعفن ترین crime انسانها تا به حال. And so they were really, really against it. Some of the other writers in this period also were creating all these anti-slavery protests. And so they hated slavery, and they tried to use their literature as a way to encourage more and more people to fight with slavery. And so, as we have been talking about Frederick Douglass for some time now. So all of Frederick Douglass's books, like The Heroic Slave, or another writer, Francis Harper, he also wrote anti-slavery poetry, or Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. They were really, really successful and influential books about the slavery situation. And so, again, they were trying to get rid of slavery. خب دولت هم که ایالت‌های مختلف هم نمیخواستن اسلیوری رو از دست بدن، مخصوصا ایالت‌های جنوبی دیگه. یعنی ایالت‌های جنوبی کل اصلا صنعتشون بر اساس این بود که اسلیو بیارن روی مزارع کاتن و پنبهشون کار کنن و هیچ گونه چیزی هم نداشتن دیگه، هیچ گونه صنعت دیگه هم نداشتن. یعنی مثل ایالت‌های شمالی صنعتی نبودن که بگی کارخونه و فلان و اینا دارن. در نتیجه یک کانفلیکت و کشمکشی بین شمال و جنوب آمریکا به وجود میاد. یه قانونی هم اونجا والا وضع میشه به اسم Fugitive Slave Act. توی این قانون میگن که اگر برده‌ای فرار کنه از ایالت‌های جنوبی و بخواد مثلا به آزادی برسه و بره مثلا شمال اونجا، شما حق داری هر بلایی خواستی سرش بیاری. این قانون 1850، یعنی حتی بکشیش، خیلی راحت از حلق‌آویزش کنی اصلا. این قانون باعث خیلی خشم زیادی توی آمریکا شد. And so again, writers of the period hated it so much, and Thoreau, one of those writers who hated paying taxes for the Mexican War, actually wrote an essay called Slavery in Massachusetts. And of course, he delivered it on the 4th of July, and which is like the Independence Day in the United States. And then he described this as a kind of like barbaric kind of law in the United States. But even Melville tried to do this. So Melville writes a short story called Benito Cereno, which is an anti-slavery kind of short story. And then he says that, well, this free America that we talk about, is just something as intrepid, unprincipled, reckless, predatory as it can be, because it just shows that we are savages in our heart. یعنی ما میگه که این کار شما دارین با سیاه‌پوستا انجام میدین نشانه بزدلی شماست، بیقانونی شماست و شما مثل یک پردیتور هستین که میخواین مردمان رو مثلا به کشتن بدین و این سیویلیزیشنی که شما ازش دم میزنین در واقع چیزی نیست بجز اینکه شما یک آدم وحشی هستین در قلبتون. And so there were some anti-slavery books published in the North, but the South was not silent. So the Southerners passionately defended slavery in books like, for example, George Fitzhugh's Sociology of the South, Caroline Lee Hence's book, The Planter's Northern Bride. They were all anti-Uncle Tom's Cabin books. پس کتاب‌هایی بودن در گسترش اسلیوری و اینکه چقدر اسلیوری خوبه. همه اینها خب تنش‌های زیادی رو به وجود آورد بین شمال و جنوب. یه اتفاق دیگه ای هم که خیلی کلیدی بود این که جان براون، یکی از افراد خیلی مهم در تاریخ آمریکا، که یک ابالیشنیست بود، یعنی کسی که به دنبال برچیدن این سازوکار اسلیوری بود و میخواست از بینش ببره، حمله میکنن به یه فری به اسم هارپر و با کمک یک سری سیاه پوست دیگه، یک سری اسلیو دیگه، در واقع یک اسلیو ریبلیون رو میخوان در جنوب را بندازن. این به اصطلاح حمله با شکست مواجه میشه، یعنی نیروها تقریبا و این کو به اصطلاح این ریبلیون در جا در نطفه خفه میشه و خیلی موفقیتی شامل حالشون نمیشه. اما تعداد زیاد کشته هایی که این به اصطلاح رید داره و کشته شدن تعداد زیادی از سیاه پوستانی که آقای جان براون جمع کرده بود، در واقع نقطه شروع، یعنی اون به اصطلاح نقطه عطف اون کبریتیه که توی انبار کاه انداخته میشه و تبدیل میشه به American Civil War. Now, the American Civil War started on April 12th, 1861, and the Confederate forces of the South started fighting with the northern forces. And so a lot of people were saying that, hey, it's just going to be a few months, it's just going to be a few weeks. But of course, unfortunately, it continued for 4 years. Over 600,000 Americans died before finally the forces of Robert E. Lee, the commander of the South, finally surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant in Virginia, and they ended the Civil War and they surrendered. یعنی تسلیم شدن و جنوب آمریکا در واقع شکست خورد و البته هرچند ایالتهای جنوبی آمریکا تا همین چند وقت پیش هم باز مثلا پرچمای اون دوره رو داشتن، به جای پرچم آمریکا پرچم کنفدرسی رو میذاشتن روی ساختمانهای دولتیشون. انقدر مثلا هنوز اعتقاد داشتن که همچین چیزی بد بوده. خب چون جنوب آمریکا اکثرا سفید پوستن و خب به اسلیوری هنوز هم خیلیشون اعتقاد دارن و تا همین چند وقت پیش هم مجسمه های بزرگی از رابرت ای لی و اینا در شهرهای مختلف وجود داشت. تا همین چند وقت پیش کشیدن پایین اون مجسمه ها رو. And so the American Civil War was also a very defining moment in the history of America. And so finally it started on April 12th and it finally finished on April 9th, 1865. The American Civil War can be seen in so many works of literature, and this is the reason why we're talking about it, because a lot of writers in this period reacted to this. So, for example, we have Walt Whitman, who write drum taps. Melville write battle pieces. Henry James later on writes The Bostonians, which focuses on the Reconstruction era, the period after the Civil War when the country now had to find a new identity for itself, which was against slavery, etc. And so we have so many different writers who reacted to this kind of terrible war. As you can see, like a lot of people just died on the lands. And so we have different traditions. tradition های مختلفی هم داریم بچه ها. یعنی اینکه چه نوع ریاکشنی به جنگ داخلی نشون میدی قشنگ جایگاه تو رو نشون میده که شاید میشه گفت تفاوتش رو توی آقای والت ویتمن و هرمن ملویل میتونیم داشته باشیم. آقای ویتمن اعتقاد به آشتی بین دو طرف داشت، یعنی میگه آقا بیاین با هم دیگه آشتی کنین، در حالی که آقای ملویل از اون طرف میگفت که توی مخصوصا کتاب بتل پیسز میگه که از شمالیا میخواست که بابا حالا شما جنوبیا رو شکست دادین ولی این سفید پوسته جنوب رو خیلی کاری نداشته باشین. یعنی حتی حالا نویسنده یا مثل ملویل که اینقدر بهبه و چهچه میکنیم براش، کلی هم ازش تعریف کردیم، باز همون به اصطلاح سنتیمنت اینکه برتری سفید پوستان درش موجود بود، در حالی که مثلا ویتمن میگفت آقا بیاین با هم دیگه آشتی کنیم، زندگی مسالمت آمیز داشته باشین. این میگفت که به شمالیا میگفت حالا تو رو خدا خیلی این وایت ها رو توی جنوب کاری نداشته باشینا، که باز میگم باز اینم قشنگ نشون میده که چقدر پرابلماتیک بوده و هنوزم به اون دوره اعتقاد داشتن. ولی خب این دوره ریکنستراکشن واقعا دوره مفیدی نبود، یعنی اینطوری نبود که حالا آمریکایی‌ها بگن که خب دیگه همه چی تمام شد، گل و بلبل دیگه، اسلیوری نمونده، اسلیوری نو مور، و اینکه همه چی حل شد. نه اصلا واقعا اینطوری نبود. و خب آقای ویتمن در واقع توی کتاب دموکراتیک ویستاز به همین موضوع میپردازه که چقدر با شکست مواجه شد اون آرمان ها و رویاهایی که در سر داشتن. فردریک داگلسی هم که صحبت کردیم راجبش، اونم دقیقا اشاره میکنه توی The Lessons of the Hour و همچنین بعدش What to the Slave ببخشین توی سخنرانی The Lessons of the Hour که اولین اثرش بود بعد از مقاله معروفش What to a Slave is the 4th of July. اینکه مثلا برای یه اسلیو دقیقا روز استقلال آمریکا چه معنی داره. به این قضیه اشاره میکنه که تا وقتی که آمریکا این مشکل اسلیوری خودش و نژاد پرستی خودش و ریسیزم خودش رو برطرف نکنه، هیچ وقتی ریپابلیک شما رشد نخواهد کرد مگر اینکه این مشکلتون رو حل کنین. So this is another kind of conflict that existed in the period which was really, really influential. Let's take a very short break and then we will talk about the final part of today's presentation. Okay, and finally, I know that the video is very long, but well, we had to cover all of this. And the final thing that we're going to talk about is that, well, so what happened to these American writers? And the title that Norton Anthology has written for this part is The Small World and the Large World of the American Writers. Now, very simply put, this is what this sentence means, this phrase means. That, well, they had a small world, which means that they really knew each other. All of these writers knew each other. They gave each other their books before publishing them so that they could publish them, but also they had a large world, which means that they became famous step by step and they started publishing their books elsewhere, or for example selling their books in other countries and finding a good readership in European countries as well. That's the meaning of this title. So the writers of this period influenced one another greatly and read each other's works like voraciously. And their influence reached beyond the borders of the United States. And so they were, finding a good reputation for themselves. I told you about some of the examples. So, for example, Washington Irving was in England when the sketchbook was published, and he just stayed there. So, even though he was a famous American writer, he stayed in Europe, in England, and later on in Spain. James Fenimore Cooper traveled to France and remained in Europe for 7 years. So he was not, limited to the United States. Margaret Fuller also remained in Europe, remained in Italy for some time, and wrote some of her books and articles there. Nathaniel Hawthorne was also a very famous traveler because he was, as I said, he had a lot of political posts and positions, so he traveled all around the world, just like what Poe did, what Emerson did, what Longfellow did. And so I just wanted to say that, even though these writers knew each other, they communicated with each other, it doesn't mean that they were limited to the small world of New England or, for example, Massachusetts or, for example, New York. They traveled to all these European places. They actually found audiences there. And they were influenced by contemporary sources in Europe, like, as I said, English writers, French writers, but also they were really, really influenced by the classics of ancient Greece and Rome. They were influenced by Greco-Roman myth, by Indian and Asian religions. A lot of them did comparative religions. And of course, they were influenced by the writers of the English Renaissance period, including Shakespeare, Milton, the German Romantics, the English Romantics later on. And of course, all of this contributed to the fact that the period between 1820 and 1865 became one of the most important or one of the most prolific periods in the history of America. But something which is significant when we have to talk about is that they knew that they were creating new traditions and for future writers. And so most of these writers are completely aware that this is a new era and they are now the founding fathers of the literary tradition of America. Yes, Benjamin Franklin and all of those founding fathers established in America, but these writers who were living and who were producing works from 1820 to 1865 became the founding fathers of the literary America, the literary tradition of America. And that's why this period, the importance of this period cannot really be overstated. It is really, really important. Anyway, thank you very much. This is all I have to say about this period. I really hope that you learned a thing or two by watching my lecture. Now, for next week, we are going to do our we are going to actually start reading some of the works written by these writers because it's important for us to read works, just like what we did in the previous session about Off Plymouth Plantation. Let me just open the syllabus and then we will talk about this. So let's talk about the syllabus. So we talked about this period here. It was supposed to be 2 sessions, but that's why I decided to record all of it so that we could have more sessions to read works. Okay, so we are going to start with the 1820s again, because that's when we said this kind of national literature was born. So for next session, I want you to read a story called Rip Van Winkle. I'm gonna send you the text of that short story. And then I'm going to talk about James Fenimore Cooper's The Pioneers. یه بخش کوتاهی ازش رو براتون میفرستم ولی نخوندینم نخوندین، یعنی برای الان نخوندین، برای امتحان که باید بخونین. خودم بیشتر راجع به جیمز فنیمر کوپر و اثر پایونیرزش براتون صحبت خواهم کرد، ولی ازتون انتظار دارم که برای جلسه آینده داستان کوتاه ریپ رو از واشنگتن ایروینگ حتما خونده باشین. خودم در مورد پایونیرز براتون صحبت میکنم. جلسه بعدترش فقط و فقط اختصاص میدیم به Self-Reliance امرسون. فقط خودم راجع به یه اثر دیگهش American Scholar هم صحبت میکنم. این برای 2 هفته بعده و بعدش یک جلسه کامل رو هم اختصاص میدیم به هنری دیوید تورو و اثر والدنش. پس الان جلسه امروزمون که این شد، جلسه آینده راجع به 1820s واشنگتن ایروینگ و کوپر صحبت میکنیم. از شما انتظار دارم که راجع به ریپ صحبت کنین و خودم راجع به پایونیرز. بعدش یک جلسه کامل برای 2 هفته آینده راجع به امرسون و یک جلسه کامل 3 هفته بعد راجع به هنری دیوید تورو با هم دیگه صحبت خواهیم کرد. این اثر سلف ریلاینس رو براتون میفرستم. بخش هایی از 1-2 تا چپتر از کتاب والدن رو هم براتون میفرستم که بخونین و به صورت تکستچوال راجع به همشون صحبت میکنیم و دیگه بعدش آثار که تموم شد، این 4 تا اثر رو که بحث کردیم، راجع به اصطلاح رئالیسم و نچرالیسم در ادبیات آمریکا صحبت میکنیم. احتمال داره که یک ویدیو هم براتون بفرستم در مورد ناتانیال هاتورن یا مارک توین. حالا صحبت میکنیم راجع به مارک توین بعدن، اما اینجا هم میشه راجبش صحبت کرد. حالا بهتون میگم چرا میشه حتی قبل از دوره رئالیسم راجع به مارک توین صحبت کرد. ولی خب شاید یک ویدیو هم، چون دیگه نمیخوام یه سشن جدا باشه، شاید یه ویدیو راجع به هاتورن براتون فرستادم، چون خب هاتورن نویسنده بسیار مهمی. به هر حال ممنون که ویدیو رو نگاه کردین. ان شاءالله هفته آینده با این داستان میبینمتون. روز خوبی داشته باشین و فعلا خدا نگهدار.